And Ranjit asked me just to say a word about just to the guests on our own about why people join Rotary. And I think it's really for three reasons. People join for the relationships, and there's just some amazing relationships that you will come to have by joining Rotary. And certainly in the Charlotte Dilworth Club, a lot of remarkable people in that club. And I think the second reason people join is
we lost your audio there for a second, Mike.
Sorry, Mike, I was trying to hit somebody else and I muted you.
Yeah, please unmute yourself, Mike. Sorry.
Here we go. Okay, sorry about that. So the second reason is the most common reason, and that's to provide service to others. And that can be locally, internationally, on a large scale, small scale. Bring your passion, find your passion. Either one is fine. And the third reason is for growth, personal and professional growth. It's a place to grow personally and take on new challenges. And so if you're thinking about Rotary, think in terms of relationships, service, and growth, and one of those three reasons. And with that, Ranjit, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. That was excellent. And now we're going to have Peter Kyle speak. Peter has just set off a wonderful initiative in Rotary tied to peace. And our speaker today and his topic is also deeply embedded in the peace movement around the world. So with that, Peter, if you would go ahead and introduce the speaker and say any words that you would like to about your new initiative as well. Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you, Ranjit, and good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be with you. Special greetings to District Governor Mike and to District Governor-elect Nico. You know, one of the great things about Rotary is that because of the respect in which the organization is held around the world, the strength of our brand, from time to time, we are able to attract the very best speakers that the world has to offer. And today we are blessed to have an amazing person as our speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Ramachandra Guhi. He is an Indian writer whose research interests include environmental, social, economics, political, contemporary, and cricket history. And he's a columnist for many organizations, the Telegraph, Hindustan Times, the Hindi daily newspaper. He's an expert on Mahatma Gandhi. He has written extensively on the work of Mahatma Gandhi, the years that changed the world. He's received various prizes for his research into Mr. Gandhi. He has written extensively. He has a long bio, and I won't read it all because I want to hear what he has to say. But the one thing I do want to mention, and if I may just say to Mr. Guhi, I'm from New Zealand, you're from India. We have a friendly rivalry in the form of cricket. And I was fascinated to read in your bio that you have written extensively on cricket. As a journalist and as a historian, you've researched the social history of Indian cricket, which culminated in a work, A Corner of a Foreign Field, the Indian history of a British sport. The book charts the development of cricket in India from its inception during the British Raj. And last year you published The Commonwealth of Cricket, a lifelong love affair with the most subtle and sophisticated game known to humankind. That is how we of British stock regard cricket. And I'm pleased to say that in my part of the world, in Maryland, cricket is gaining in popularity. But Mr. Guhi is here to talk about Gandhi. Mr. Guhi, we welcome you. We look forward to your remarks. We thank you for sharing your time with us. And may I now invite you to address the Rotary Club.
Thank you, Mr. Kyle. Thank you all. Before I come to Gandhi, I'm glad you mentioned cricket, and it was very nice to know you're from New Zealand. Later this year, in fact, in the month of June, India and New Zealand will play the final of the first ever World Test Championship in a 5-day test in England. And I am rooting for New Zealand
Thank you.
for the reason that I am not a cricketing nationalist. And for the additional reason that 1.2 billion Indians deserve a cricketing lesson from, 5 million New Zealanders. So I'm actually hoping secretly, though I may have my passport revoked if this gets out in the public domain, I actually want New Zealand to win. There's a third reason, that the Kiwi cricketers are incredibly courteous and polite and not at all brash and aggressive, unlike the Australians, for example. And in sporting behavior, contemporary Indian cricketers have unfortunately taken Australians as their model and not the, because what the Kiwis have shown in every sport, and indeed in politics, I mean, you have a fabulous prime minister, that you can win without being nasty. I think that's, and I suppose that's a message that should resonate with all you Rotarians as well. So enough of cricket and Gandhi. I'm going to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes on the significance of Gandhi in his own lifetime and what his ideals may say to us in the world we live in today. But I will have to necessarily give you some biographical details. Even those of you who know a lot about Gandhi, it's important to locate the development of his thought in the context of his own life. So Gandhi was born in 1869 in a small port town in Western India called Porbandar, which is now in the state of Gujarat. It was then a small chiefdom. And Gandhi's father worked in the court of the local Maharaja. Gandhi grew up in that part of India, first in Porbandar, then in a town nearby called Rajkot, where he graduated from high school, and then went on to London to study law. Now, this was an incredibly transgressive experience for a young Indian in the late 19th century. In fact, Gandhi's caste mates believed that it was polluting to cross the ocean, and they excommunicated him for daring to go from Gujarat to London to study law in the 1880s. He went there, and while in London, made his first foreign friends. In fact, in another quite radical transgressive act, he joined the Vegetarian Society of London because he was a vegetarian and learned how to campaign for a worthy cause. And one of his fellow society members, Josiah Oldfield, became such a close friend of Gandhi that they shared an apartment together. A white man and a brown man in the imperial capital, London, in the year 1889. Incredibly radical and you could say transgressive act. So Gandhi comes back to India after his law degree. He's already married, he has a child. He wants to establish himself as a lawyer in Bombay, as Mumbai was then known, the great financial capital of India. And I don't know, some of you may have been to Bombay. I know Ranjit knows Bombay. In South Bombay, there's some beautiful Gothic buildings built in the 19th century. And one of the most gorgeous of these buildings is the High Court. And Gandhi tried to establish his practice there and failed. And because he failed, I'm talking to you here today. Every time I go to Bombay myself and pass that High Court, I offer a silent prayer of thanksgiving for Gandhi's failure to make it as a barrister in an incredibly competitive profession in that city. Because if Gandhi had succeeded as a barrister in Bombay, he would have remained trapped in the comfortable middle-class professional world of successful lawyers. Gandhi was a Gujarati. Bombay had many Gujarati merchants fighting with each other about property and terms of trade. He would have been settling their disputes. He would have been speaking Gujarati to them. They would have been from his same caste, Baniya caste, and his moral universe would not have expanded at all. He would have gone to London, where his universe expanded. He would have come back to Bombay and hung out with Gujaratis and become a parochial guy like most Indians and most people around the world still are today. But fortunately, he failed. And he was rescued from professional obscurity by an invitation from South Africa, where there was a Gujarati community and there was a legal dispute. And that legal dispute required the adjudicator to both know the British colonial legal system and the language Gujarati, because many of the documents were in the Gujarati script. So he goes to South Africa to solve this dispute and stays more than 20 years. He becomes, unlike, very successful professionally, unlike in Bombay, partly because there was no competition. He was the only Indian lawyer, and there were 150,000 Indians in the diaspora, and he had a kind of monopoly practice. But it was also his sincerity, his transparency, his doggedness, and his commitment that won him professional acclaim. But more than professional acclaim, he became an activist for the rights of Indians there. You know, this is the period we're talking about, is the last decade of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century. And there's a clear hierarchy in South Africa, with the Europeans on top, the Indians in between, and the Africans right at the bottom. And although the Indians are in between, they are seriously discriminated against. They're not allowed to own property in white-owned areas. Certain professions are barred to them. Intermarriage is prohibited. They can't cross provincial boundaries without permission. They have to pay a poll tax because they're not white. And Gandhi organizes his fellow Indians against these different forms of discrimination. It's also in South Africa that Gandhi discovers other kinds of Indians. So the lawyer who, I beg your pardon, the merchant who invites him to settle his dispute is a Muslim. But Gandhi starts a political organization. The first funder is a Parsi. He befriends several Jews in South Africa who also happen to be vegetarians. And one of them, Henry Pollack, becomes his closest friend. And when Henry Pollack marries a Christian, Gandhi, a Hindu, is the witness to that marriage. So his universe is expanding. He is shedding his parochialism and coming to understand that India itself, his homeland, is not only composed of Gujarati Hindus. It has Tamils, it has Kannadigas, it has Biharis, it has Bengalis, speaking many tongues and practicing many different faiths. Now, it's in South Africa that he first comes across the idea of non-violent civil disobedience, to resist injustice, but non-violently, not through force of arms. And after 20 years in the diaspora, he decides to return home, partly because there's a growing national movement in India and Gandhi wants to take part in it. You know, in a sense, South Africa, he's exhausted what he can do in South Africa. Having become the most prominent Indian in the diasporic community, the community itself is relatively small. He wants a larger theater for his work, for his ideals, and which is why he returns to India in 1915. And he spends the next 30 odd years working, living, struggling in his homeland. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on the second part of his life, because his stewardship and leadership of the Indian freedom struggle is known to all of you. At least the main elements, the highlights, the milestones is known to all of you. But I'm going to, about this period of Gandhi's life, pick up on something he said exactly 100 years ago, an epigrammatic statement he made 100 years ago, which really summarizes his life's philosophy almost better than anything else he wrote. In 1920, Gandhi launched the first of three major popular campaigns against British colonial rule. This was called the non-cooperation campaign. This was between 1920 and 1922. 10 years later, in 1930, came the second of his campaigns, the most famous of all, the March to the Sea. And a decade later, in 1942, came the Quit India movement. And these three struggles, mass mobilizations, always conducted on non-violent lines, basically, slowly, steadily prepared the way for Indian independence and the final departure of the British from my country in August 1947. But in the first of these movements, the non-cooperation movement of 1920-21, Gandhi defined freedom. The Indian word is Swaraj. So he used the word Swaraj. And there's a double meaning to Swaraj. Swaraj is freedom for the country, but also freedom for oneself. In Hindi, it has that double meaning. It's not just collective, but it's also individual. It's your emancipation and your country's emancipation. And he defined freedom or Swaraj. He said, when freedom comes to India, when India becomes independent of British rule, what should this freedom look like? What should this Swaraj rest on? And he offered this wonderful image. He said, Swaraj will be like a bed. And this bed will have 4 sturdy posts. And what are these 4 sturdy posts? Non-violence, Hindu-Muslim harmony, abolition of untouchability, and economic self-reliance. And he said, these are the 4 ideals of the Indian freedom struggle. Non-violence, resist injustice, put forward your point of view, but without ever resorting to violence. The second pillar, Hindu-Muslim harmony, India's 2 largest religious communities with a long history of bloody rivalry and disputation. They must work together. They must suppress their personal religious differences in the larger national cause. Abolition of untouchability, because India was riven by a graded system of inequality, the caste system, in which you had 4 castes according to hierarchy: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, and below them a 5th caste who were literally untouchable, who did all the menial and degrading work, and who were really treated like blacks were in the South, in the American South, through much of the 20th century, not just the 19th century. That's the 3rd pillar. The 4th pillar, economic self-reliance, and that was because as a result of colonization by the British, Indian industries had been destroyed. India had become a market for British finished products and a place from which raw materials were exported out to the West. So to end economic colonialism, you had to cultivate economic self-reliance. Now that's and then he said, these are the 4 pillars of Swaraj, of freedom. Non-violence, Hindu-Muslim harmony, abolition of untouchability, and economic self-reliance. And then Gandhi goes on to say, each of these 4 pillars have to be sturdy. If one is kind of weak or rotting or eaten up by termites, the whole structure will collapse. Right. Now, I think that's an absolutely fabulous image. And it was really, in some ways, it provided the inspiration for the Indian Constitution, which came into being after India became independent. Non-violence, that's why India adopted a political system based on universal adult franchise. It remains almost the only country in the poorer part of the world that has a political system not based on one-party rule such as communism, not based on religious theocracy, not based on dictatorship, but on multi-party democracy on the Western model. Universal adult franchise, with women getting the vote as soon as India became independent. So that's one part of the pillar. The second part of the pillar is Hindu-Muslim harmony. Unlike Pakistan, which was created at the same time as India, but has been from its beginning explicitly self-identified as a Muslim country, in which non-Muslims are, so to say, second-class citizens. India's constitution refused to discriminate between citizens on the grounds of religion. Abolition of untouchability, which is again a core part of the Indian constitution. And of course, it was not just the abolition of caste distinctions, but the abolition of gender distinctions, because caste and gender were, and regrettably to some extent still are, the fundamental axes of social discrimination in India, and economic self-reliance. With a poor country with a large proportion of its population below the poverty line, you had to grow economically so that you could hold your own in a complex, interdependent, and conflict-ridden world of nation states. Now, that's Gandhi's vision for India. It's an open question as to how much of it has been realized. In a book I wrote called India After Gandhi, I described India as a 50-50 democracy. So I think there's some aspects of our public and social life Gandhi would have approved of, and others he would have been deeply dismayed by. If you think of India in 2021, among the aspects of our life that Gandhi would have been upset by are growing Hindu majoritarianism and the stigmatization of the Muslim minority, rampant environmental degradation, because Gandhi was an early environmental prophet, and I think the kind of abusive and uncivil tone of public discourse, because Gandhi believed in non-violence, not just in deed, but also in word. But there are other aspects of our life he may have been happy about. The fact that we have a thriving civil society movement, the fact that we, despite all the prophets of doom, we have still remained together as a united country without facing the kind of civil wars that Sri Lanka and Pakistan faced, or your own country faced in the 19th century, a civil war whose scars are still alive. So 50-50 democracy is the kind of verdict Gandhi might have given India. Now, one of Gandhi's ideals, the idea of non-violent resistance to discrimination and injustice, of course, has traveled all across the world and took root in your country, or the country where all of you are based right now, regardless of your original nationality. And the civil rights movement, in many ways, was a fulfillment of Gandhi's dreams. And Gandhi saw it like this. In 1936, a great civil rights leader called Howard Thurman, who was later a mentor of Martin Luther King, went with his wife to visit Gandhi in his ashram, in his rural settlement in central India. And they spent some time with Gandhi discussing their problems and his. And as they left, Gandhi said, "It is through you, African Americans, that the unadulterated message of non-violence will reach the world." So he gave them that blessing. And of course, King admired Gandhi, read Gandhi in jail, out of jail, visited India. Another very great follower and admirer of Gandhi was Congressman John Lewis, who died recently after an incredibly rich and fulfilling life, which all of you would know of and celebrate. And I was listening to a program after John Lewis's death, and he was talking about his debt to Gandhi. And he said from Gandhi, he learned the value of nonviolence, of interfaith harmony, of dignity, of courage. And then he said he learned something else. He said he learned from Gandhi how to disagree without being disagreeable. And I think that's a lesson every politician in the world can take to heed. So that is Gandhi's influence on your country. But before I close my introductory remarks, and I'd really love to have a more interactive discussion on some of the things I've talked about, and maybe other aspects of Gandhi's life, which I haven't touched on, but which you may want more information on. I'll just say one last thing about Gandhi. About Gandhi's greatest attributes as an individual was his ability to grow and to discard early prejudices. As a young man, Gandhi was a racist. When he went to South Africa in his early 20s, he completely bought into the then commonplace hierarchy of races, as Europeans at the top, Indians a little below, and Africans at the bottom. And he thought the Africans were uncivilized, and he did not want his fellow Indians to really mix with them or forge a common front with them. But the longer he lived in South Africa, he outgrew his racism. He worked with them. He grew to appreciate their courage, their moral compass. He started his journey in the diaspora as a racist. He ended it as a non-racist. And then later, after he came back to India, he became a principled and consistent anti-racist. In the 1930s, he was in touch with Howard Thurman. Before that, in the 1920s, he was in touch with the great W.E.B. Du Bois. And in the 1940s, he was consistently telling Indians in South Africa that they had to forge a joint front with the Africans. So his ability to shed his early prejudices and to move towards a more open-minded, more capacious, more progressive understanding of the racial question. Likewise with gender. Gandhi early on was a typical Hindu patriarch who believed that women's place was in the home. They had to rear the children. They had to be submissive. They had to take their orders. Both women and children had to take their orders from the father, the man, the head of the household. In South Africa, his patriarchal prejudices were challenged by two remarkable white women. his friend Henry Pollack's wife, Millie Pollack, and Gandhi's old secretary, who was a very spirited Jewish woman called Sonia Schlesien. And under their influence, he slowly started shedding his patriarchal prejudices. He comes back to India, and here he meets two remarkable Indian women who make him move even further in the direction of gender equality. One was a poet and activist called Sarojini Naidu, who becomes the first female president of the Indian National Congress in 1924, at a time where it was inconceivable that women would be chairmen or chairpersons of the Charlotte District Democratic or Republican Committee, let alone head of a national party. And following Sarojini Naidu, an even more extraordinary feminist called Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who convinces Gandhi, when Gandhi wants to say the salt march is only for men, she says, we women, we don't need your permission, we will break the salt laws as well. She becomes very close to Gandhi. In 1938, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay comes to the American South, travels across the American South, meeting African American activists, telling them about Gandhi's struggles for Indian independence. So when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, when it comes to caste, Gandhi is growing all the time. And his ability to grow and change his mind and to discard narrow-minded, parochial, prejudiced positions in favor of a much more open-minded engagement, egalitarian engagement with the world that he sees around him is, I think, an object lesson in individual growth. And I think that is something that makes, among the things that makes him such a great leader and visionary. So I'll end here. And as I said, I'd love to take whatever questions you have and to continue the conversation.
Amazing, Mr. Guha, amazing. What a wonderful description of Gandhi. What a wonderful speech. We're blown away. You're going to have to give us a few minutes to absorb all this. We've already got a dozen people who want to ask questions. So let's start. We'll start from the top. Kevin, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'll just move across the board as people come in. Please use your, as Kevin and Romy and some of the others have done, if you don't mind putting your hand icon under reactions. If you can put your hand up. I'm just going to demonstrate. Like that. So if you want to put your hand icon up like I just did, and that will give me an idea of who wants to ask questions. So Kevin, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ranjit. Ram, thank you so much. This was an outstanding presentation. I am blown away, as Ranjit said. Can you inform us a little bit more about the specific influences in Gandhi's life that led him to see racial equality between the Blacks and the Indians? What influenced him? I know his time in South Africa did that, but were there specific instances in his life, as you mentioned, with the gender equality gap, specific people that actually influenced that outcome?
So that's a very good question, Kevin. In the case of the expansion of his worldview on race, it's harder to trace the influence of specific individuals. But for example, in South Africa, he ran a rural settlement in Natal, outside the town of Durban, for Indians. Across the hill was a rural settlement run by a Zulu reformer called John Dube, D-U-B-A-E. And John Dube went on to become the first president of the African National Congress. So Gandhi and he had conversations. Another founder of the ANC, Pixley Seme, we know spent a day in Gandhi's rural settlement. But there's no record of Gandhi's conversations with these Africans. But in his writings, he says in his writings, observing them, he says, we were taught to regard Africans as savage, but having observed them, I'd say their moral compass is more developed than Christians or Hindus. So he's around them, he's thinking of them, he's talking of them, but he doesn't have close conversations. He goes back, and it's possible that some of the people around him, for example, Jawaharlal Nehru, his great lieutenant, and who traveled widely across the world, who actually knew Paul Robeson quite well, and had seen the awful things that the Italians had done in Ethiopia and written about it. would have told him about it. So his son Manilal, Gandhi had a son called Manilal, who stayed on in South Africa, who worked closely with Chief Albert Luthuli of the African National Congress. So through the son, through Nehru was really more or less adopted Gandhi's political heir. So through people with greater experience than him in interacting with black people, he was learning. Then there were people visiting him. So Howard Thurman came to see him. Then there's a wonderful description of World War II and African-American soldiers going to call on Gandhi, and he is having conversations with them. So the interesting thing in South Africa was that in his years in South Africa, he mostly hung out only with Indians and with some radical Europeans. He didn't really have any African friends at all, because that was the kind of segregated society they lived in. But by observing them at work, there's an article he writes in his magazine in South Africa in about 1905, it's quoted in my biography, where the town hall of, I think it was Durban, Africans could do their high school examination in the town hall, and there's an edict passed that the Africans have to go to some obscure place, and this is only for white students. And he writes an editorial against it. So, so these experiences, but unlike in the case of gender, one can't identify. He never really had a close African friend. I mean, that's the truth. He had African contacts later, but people like Nehru, his son Devdas, would have told him about racial discrimination.
Excellent answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Romy, Kaywood, Mrs. Raleigh, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Mr. Guha, I understood the image that you conveyed from Gandhi of the 4 pillars that he viewed as necessary for India to thrive. And I'm curious about your thoughts about any kind of aspect of universality to those principles, that is the extent to which you view them as applicable to other societies. I guess the first question would be, did Gandhi see those as universal principles for a society, not just India? And then of course, I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
So, absolutely. So I think before I answer your question, which is an important one, I'd like to say something about, I spoke about Gandhi's how living outside India expanded his mind. So did his conversations with the great Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, who was a lifelong opponent of xenophobia and narrow nationalism. So Gandhi's nationalism meant not only traveling to other countries and other cultures, but learning from them. He says somewhere, no nation can afford to be a frog in the well. It helps you to understand your mistakes if other people tell you what they are, right? So that sense, he was not a nationalist. He was you could call him a universalist. I mean, he was an Indian. I mean, he believed his home was in India. He had to improve India, but not by demonizing Pakistan or Sri Lanka, and certainly by engaging with the West, with Japan and China, and learning from them. Now, so that was his kind of his philosophical orientation. As for his own views, which are the views of Gandhi that travel easily outside India? Clearly non-violence, because that has been applied in many places, as in the civil rights movement. But interfaith harmony, I think, is an idea of his that is incredibly resonates with the tragic and sectarian violence that we see in the world around us. Environmental sustainability, I can speak more about it, but it's an element in all his life, and kind of the openness and accessibility of Gandhi, that he was not, he was always in conversation with his opponents. He had no personal hatreds. I mean, he had disagreements, and he could resolve them without being disagreeable. So in his personal conduct, of course, that too, given how arrogant and megalomaniac, particularly our male politicians tend to be, in your country, in my country, and in countries around the world. So I think there's several aspects of his philosophy and his personal style that are clearly relevant, whatever your nationality or your religion. But there are others that are not. I mean, I've not spoken about Gandhi's failures. My books talk about them in some degree. He was an indifferent father. He wanted to direct his children and tell them what they should do with their lives. he had an obsession with celibacy, which is fine personally, but he tried to impose it on other people. So there were certain personal idiosyncrasies of Gandhi that I would not recommend to anyone.
I see. Mhm. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Quanta, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Guha, I was wondering if you are familiar with Dr. James Hunt from North Carolina. He was a scholar on Gandhi
Yes.
and very close friend of mine. He died about 10 years ago. I was wondering if you met him while he was in India.
Well, thank you. Sadly, I never met him, but I admired his work. And just the other day, I recommended his wonderful book, Gandhi in London, to someone who wrote to me. So he was a fine, pioneering scholar of Gandhi. His book, Gandhi in London, is a classic. It deals with Gandhi. I spoke about Gandhi as a law student in London, but Gandhi actually, that was the first of 5 trips Gandhi made to London. He went in 1906 and in 1909 as representing South African Indians. Then in 1914 on his way back to India, and then in 1931 for the Round Table Conference. And he loved London. He had made all kinds of interesting connections and relationships he had in London. And James Hunt's book, Gandhi in London, is first rate. He then wrote a series of articles which are in a subsequent book of his, which are also cited in my biography, which is to do with his relations with the Jewish community in South Africa, and an architect called Herman Kallenbach in particular. So I did not know James Hunt, but as a scholar, I'm forever indebted to his work, and I'm happy to meet you virtually as a friend of James Hunt.
Thank you.
Excellent. Any other questions? Please raise your hand before you. All right. I don't see any other questions. Mr. Guha, would you talk a little bit about the caste in the United States? Because there's been a really interesting book out about caste and the parallel between African American treatment in the U.S., untouchables treatment in India, and there seems to be this common thread that goes back to Gandhi. So it feels like there's this connection between these two countries that's at a visceral level about suffering and separation and etc. Would you address that a little bit?
I will, and I'll bring in, I will, Ranjit, and in doing so, I'll bring in another very great figure who links India and America, a man called B.R. Ambedkar, whom you would know of, but some of your colleagues might not. So I'll say a little bit about that. So caste as a system of discrimination, stratification is very similar to race. So in untouchables had to live outside the village. They did not have access to a clean water source. They could not worship in a temple. They certainly could not marry an upper caste woman. Very similar to the ways in which African Americans were historically treated in your country. That it was not just your inferiority was rubbed into you at every turn, in every moment of your life. So it was really a truly awful system, untouchability. And in that sense, it's very similar to race. Now, Gandhi was a guilt-ridden upper caste reformer. So you can think of him as comparable to, say, a great white liberal of the 1920s or 30s. I say Louis Mumford. There were various names may come to mind. Someone of privilege who recognizes that he is benefiting from an awful system of exploitation and discrimination and wants to end it, but from above. So Gandhi was a guilt-ridden upper caste reformer, and a younger contemporary of Gandhi was a truly great person born in an untouchable home called B.R. Ambedkar, who was a brilliant student as a young man, got a scholarship to study in Columbia University in New York, where he did a PhD, where he came into contact with the civil rights question as it was in New York in the 1920s, faced discrimination, went back and started mobilizing the untouchables for emancipation. So there was Gandhi, who was trying to reform the system from above, and there was Ambedkar, who was trying to, more like, you could say, like a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X, who had experienced discrimination himself. And through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, these two men had a series of debates and arguments. They had different perspectives. Gandhi thought that you could end untouchability and save Hinduism. You could purify Hinduism of the sin of untouchability, whereas Ambedkar felt that untouchability was part and parcel of Hinduism, and the only hope for untouchables was to convert altogether and become Buddhist, which is what Ambedkar finally did. So it's a very interesting, moving, inspirational, but also tragic debate, because two great human beings approaching the same problem from different perspectives. And in a sense, like, Ambedkar was, to use a very crude and imperfect analogy, the Malcolm X to Martin Luther King's, to Gandhi's Martin Luther King. Right. Now, but in my book, I've tried to present an even-handed analysis of the debate, and really to celebrate both. Because just as in America, you needed the Civil Rights Act, needed Martin Luther King and Johnson. With Barry Goldwater, you would not have had the Civil Rights Act, for example, right? So similarly, I argue that in the reform of the caste system in India, you needed pressure from above and pressure from below. So that's the context of the caste system and its challenges in India. And I think Ambedkar is an amazing, a truly remarkable person in many ways, almost as, maybe even as remarkable as Gandhi, given where he's coming from, given how much humiliation and suffering Ambedkar faces in his own life, unlike Gandhi, who was born into a middle-class, upper caste home. Now, caste is ubiquitous, like race. It's very hard to get rid of it completely. And the Indian diaspora practices it. Not someone like you, Ranjit, because your upbringing has been very different. It's been cosmopolitan, it's been westernized. You're the product yourself of an interfaith family and all of that. But people, upper caste Indians, Brahmins, are incredibly caste conscious. And Brahmins are typically have had a monopoly over learning and education. And in Silicon Valley, a large proportion of the software engineers are Brahmins. And in their software companies, they practice caste discrimination. I say this as someone who is technically a Brahmin himself, who does not practice caste discrimination at all, but knows many people from my background and how they behave even when they're in Silicon Valley. So it's, as I suppose, Americans are racist. Many Americans may be racist wherever they go, because these stereotypes, these prejudices are the product of hundreds and thousands of years of indoctrination and privilege. So caste is ubiquitous, and it's very hard to shake off. Despite all that Gandhi and Ambedkar did and other reformers have done or written about ever since, it's at best muted. It's by no means disappeared. It's become relatively less intense in its everyday impact in India. But it's remarkable that among highly educated Brahmin engineers in Silicon Valley, feelings of caste superiority still persist.
Thank you so much. That's a very thorough answer. Nora, if you would unmute yourself. Nora Lindenbach has a question. Nora? You need to unmute yourself. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, and I will start the video too, so you can see me when I ask the question. Thank you for your presentation. It has been very interesting. My husband, my son, and myself, we went to India in 2008. And I had a couple of experiences that I thought was interesting to share. One of them was that on the way back, which by the way, when we flew back home, I was flying with my daughter-in-law, my husband and my son stayed there for another week on business. There was a cricket game being played, some kind of a championship. And when the plane left New Delhi, the whole sky light up with fireworks. because some point, and I don't know anything about cricket, but some point was made and the pilot came on the loudspeaker and told us what happened. So it was a very beautiful impression of New Delhi by leaving with all the fireworks going on. But the reason I had on that same flight, flying back, my neighbor was a gentleman from India going back to New York. He happened to live in New York and work on Wall Street. And I think he was very frustrated because he told me almost his life story that I thought it was impressive. He was on the case system. He was contacted by a family of a young girl about 15 years younger than him, beginning 20s, who was a higher class than he was. And he was, and her family wanted to contact his family and start talking about marriage. And he said he was very hesitant at first because he knew she was a higher caste and probably would be problems there. But her family contacted his family and they did that, did all the contact, and he had never seen the girl. He went to India, he met the girl, he really liked her, she was really nice, so they were, he was happy. And then he said her family came with a lot of economical, how you call them?
Demands, dowry.
Exactly. They wanted for him to pay for her education when she came to the States, which he said it was fine, no problem. But what broke the camel back, so to say, was they wanted him to have an apartment in Delhi. And he said no. He said her family had about 4 apartments in Delhi, and he saw no need to buy himself an apartment that he was not going to use. And he said, after he said that no to that demand, suddenly he couldn't contact the girl anymore. It was over. So he was very frustrated about that. And on another thing, I noticed when we were there, I like to read the local newspapers when I travel. And on the section for marriages, looking for a bridegroom, looking for a bride, it was always said caste is not regarded, but education, it has to have an MBA. Is that still the same, what's going on, that education is very valued, but caste not?
Well, it varies a lot among different communities. So by and large, the vast majority of marriages are still within the same caste. So some modern professionals may want a more educated daughter-in-law or son-in-law. But it's the challenges, and caste, marriage is the only way you can break down the caste system. Is that if you allow marriages between different castes, then the caste system will crumble. But so by and large, it continues, so, and particularly as in the example you mentioned, women of higher castes cannot marry a man of a lower caste. A man of a higher caste it's more acceptable for him to marry a woman of a lower caste. But the newspaper ads you're talking about, these would be advertisements in English paper, which by definition becomes, not traditional or normal in India. And of course, that's why, something like having an MBA would become more important.
Thank you, Ram. With that, we will let our speaker go and really appreciate him being here today. Been a very informative speech. Thank you so much again for your time. We look forward to having a little book club where we'll read some of these books so that we can educate ourselves more. And we look forward to having you here, Ram, to host you properly in our Queen City at some close point. And with that, thank you. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. We really appreciate your words today. And now we'll conclude with our business of our Rotary Club. First, we'll be making a donation to Mr. Guha's charity of his choice, so that we will look to him to give us some direction on. And then we are also now, we will move to our announcements. So any of you guests who would like to, you're welcome to stay, but if you don't want to stay, you're welcome to leave at this point as well. Thank you all for being here. It's been really great to have you here today. And then, so